America exports a substantial share of its grain, meat, and produce to global markets, meaning a severe domestic agricultural shortfall wouldn't stay contained within national borders either. Countries that rely on American grain and livestock feed imports would feel price pressure from a scenario like this too, illustrating just how far the ripple effects of a compounding domestic water crisis could realistically travel. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who wants to understand the real structural risks shaping the country instead of scrolling past another vague headline. And that's exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for, so go ahead and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one. Now let's be exactly as careful as the science requires here, because that precision matters enormously. Nobody can predict with certainty that 2027 specifically will be the year these pressures peak simultaneously. Drought and heat patterns depend on year-to-year variability in snowpack, rainfall, and atmospheric conditions that remain genuinely difficult to forecast more than a season or two in advance. What researchers can say with much greater confidence is the direction of the underlying trend. Water agencies managing the Colorado River have already implemented multiple rounds of mandatory usage cuts across the basin's states in recent years, and long-term projections from federal water managers consistently point toward continued strain rather than significant natural recovery, absent major, sustained changes in precipitation patterns. That distinction between an uncertain specific date and a clear underlying trajectory is exactly why researchers and water managers describe this as a scenario worth actively planning around now, rather than a fixed prediction to simply wait out. Federal and state agencies have already begun incorporating this kind of scenario planning into long-term water management strategy, running models that stress test the system against increasingly severe combinations of low snowpack, high temperatures, and sustained agricultural demand, precisely because waiting for a single worst-case year to arrive before preparing would leave far too little room to respond effectively. So what would a scenario like this actually look like if it unfolded? Extended mandatory water restrictions across multiple western states simultaneously, agricultural land taken out of production due to insufficient irrigation water, rising food prices tied directly to reduced crop yields in the nation's most productive growing regions, and increased strain on electrical grids, as extreme heat drives cooling demand at the exact moment hydroelectric power generation, dependent on reservoir levels, becomes less reliable. That last piece deserves particular attention because it's the one most people overlook entirely. Hydroelectric dams along the Colorado River system generate power for millions of homes and businesses across the Southwest. When reservoir levels drop too low, that generation capacity drops with it, right, as extreme heat is simultaneously pushing electricity demand to seasonal peaks for air conditioning. Grid operators across the Southwest have already had to manage this exact tension during recent extreme heat events, coordinating power imports from other regions and issuing conservation appeals to prevent rolling blackouts during the highest demand afternoon hours. A more severe version of this scenario would test that coordination system far more aggressively than anything experienced so far, particularly if multiple states faced elevated demand and reduced hydroelectric capacity simultaneously rather than in isolated pockets. So what can you actually do with this information? Start by understanding your own region's water source and its current status, whether that's Colorado River allocations, a local aquifer, or a separate regional supply, since water restrictions tend to arrive with far less advance notice than most residents expect. If you're in an agricultural region dependent on either the Colorado River system or Ogalala groundwater, pay close attention to state and federal water management announcements, since usage restrictions and allocation cuts are increasingly common tools being used to manage this exact compounding risk in real time. Support water conservation infrastructure and policy in your own community, from efficient irrigation technology to updated municipal water systems, since these investments directly determine how well a region can absorb the kind of simultaneous heat and drought pressure this scenario describes. Consider also building a basic understanding of where your own food comes from, particularly staples like produce, grain, and meat, since supply chains tied heavily to the Colorado River Basin or the Ogalala aquifer carry more exposure to this specific risk than most consumers realize. That awareness won't change the weather, but it can inform how you think about price volatility and supply disruptions if a severe compounding year does eventually arrive. And here's the step that matters most for anyone thinking beyond their own household. Stay informed about food price trends and their connection to agricultural water availability, since a compounding heat and drought scenario across major growing regions tends to show up in grocery store prices well before it makes national headlines as a water crisis. Tracking those early price signals gives you a practical, personal early warning system, one that reflects real conditions on the ground long before any single dramatic news story announces a full-blown crisis. Before you go, let us know in the comments which part of this scenario concerns you most. the water infrastructure, the agricultural impact, or the grid strain, because each piece carries its own distinct set of risks. And if you want to keep tracking how these trends develop toward 2027 and beyond, stay subscribed, because we'll be following this story as the data continues to come in one season at a time. Let's close where we started. 3 of America's largest reservoirs, already strained for 2 decades. A heat dome settling over the nation's most productive farmland at the exact same moment. Nobody can tell you the exact year this scenario fully arrives, but the trend lines pointing toward it have been building for a very long time, and they show no clear signs of reversing on their own. That's the real takeaway worth sitting with, long after this video ends. Scenarios like this one aren't built from a single dramatic event. They're built quietly, one dry winter and one record-breaking summer at a time, until the pattern becomes too consistent for even careful, cautious researchers to ignore any longer. Picture a summer where 3 of America's largest reservoirs sit at their lowest levels in recorded history. At the exact same moment, a heat dome settles over the country's most productive farmland. That's not a distant hypothetical. That's the scenario a growing number of researchers say is already taking shape, one drought year at a time. This isn't a prediction with a fixed date attached. It's a scenario built from trends, already unfolding across the American West and Midwest, and understanding it now matters more than waiting to react once it arrives. Let's be precise before we go further, because scenario forecasting only has value when it's grounded in real, documented trends rather than speculation dressed up as certainty. What we're going to walk through is the actual pattern building across America's water and agricultural systems, why heat and drought compound each other in ways that make both worse, and what a scenario like 2027 could realistically look like if current trends continue. Start with the foundation this entire scenario rests on. The American West has spent much of the past 2 decades locked in what climate scientists increasingly describe as a mega-drought, a multi-decade dry period more severe and more persistent than anything the region has experienced in centuries of tree ring and sediment records. The Colorado River, the lifeline supplying water to roughly 40 million people across 7 states, has seen its flow shrink significantly compared to historical averages over this stretch. Now understand what that means physically, not just statistically. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the 2 massive reservoirs storing Colorado River water for the entire region, have both dropped dramatically from their historical full pool levels over the past 2 decades, at times falling low enough to threaten the physical infrastructure used to generate hydroelectric power and deliver water downstream. Read that again slowly. Not a shortage measured in inconvenience. A shortage measured in whether the infrastructure itself can keep functioning as designed. At their lowest recent points, both reservoirs approached what water managers call dead pool thresholds, the level at which water can no longer flow downstream through the dam under normal gravity, a scenario that would have been almost unthinkable when these reservoirs were built in the 20th century. Emergency interventions and negotiated. Cutbacks among the 7 states that depend on the river have so far kept that worst-case threshold from being crossed, but the margin for error has narrowed considerably compared to just a decade ago. Here's where the scenario starts to compound. Drought and extreme heat don't operate as separate problems. They actively reinforce each other. In a feedback loop, climate scientists have documented clearly. Dry soil heats up faster and holds less moisture to cool the surrounding air through evaporation, meaning drought-stricken regions tend to experience more intense, longer-lasting heat waves than they would if soil moisture were normal. That heat, in turn, accelerates evaporation from what water remains in reservoirs and soil and in crops, deepening the drought further. It's a cycle that feeds itself, and researchers say it's precisely why recent heat waves across the drought-stricken West have repeatedly broken records by wider margins than historical heat events typically did. Wildfire risk sits directly downstream of the same feedback loop, adding another layer most people don't immediately connect to drought and heat. Dry vegetation combined with extreme heat creates exactly the fuel. And ignition conditions that have driven some of the largest wildfire seasons in Western history in recent years, seasons that themselves strain emergency resources, degrade air quality across huge swaths of the country, and in some cases damage the very watersheds that feed the reservoirs already under stress. But that's not even the most consequential part of this scenario. Layer America's agricultural heartland on top of this pattern, and the stakes shift from regional water stress to something with national and even global implications. The Ogalala aquifer, an enormous underground water reserve stretching beneath parts of 8 states from South Dakota to Texas, supplies roughly a third of all irrigation water used in American agriculture. Drawn significant portions of this aquifer down substantially in its most heavily farmed regions. Now here's why that matters for a scenario involving simultaneous heat and drought. When surface water from rivers and reservoirs becomes scarce during a drought, farmers lean harder on groundwater to keep crops alive, accelerating aquifer depletion at precisely the moment it can least afford additional strain. That's exactly the compounding pressure water researchers have flagged as a long-term structural risk to America's food production capacity. Unlike a river or reservoir, which can at least theoretically refill relatively quickly given enough rainfall, aquifers like the Ogalala recharge on geological timescales, sometimes centuries, because the water was largely deposited there long before modern agriculture began drawing it down. In practical terms, that means water pumped from portions of this aquifer today, particularly in its most heavily depleted regions, is effectively gone for any time frame that matters to current farmers or their children, a distinction that makes this specific water source fundamentally less resilient to a bad drought year than surface water alternatives. Let that land for a second. Two of the country's most critical water systems, the Colorado River Basin and the Ogalala Aquifer, both already under significant long-term strain, both vulnerable to exactly the kind of compounding heat and drought pattern that has become increasingly common in recent years. To understand why a scenario combining both pressures simultaneously would be so consequential, you have to understand how tightly connected America's food and water systems already are. A significant share of the nation's fruits, vegetables, and nuts come from California's Central Valley, a region entirely dependent on a combination of Colorado River water, local reservoirs, and groundwater pumping to sustain its agricultural output. The Great Plains, dependent heavily on Ogalala groundwater, produces a substantial share of the nation's grain and livestock feed. A severe, simultaneous heat and drought event hitting both regions in the same growing season wouldn't just threaten regional water supplies, it would put pressure on crop yields across multiple major food categories at once with ripple effects, reaching grocery prices and export markets far beyond the affected states themselves.